For months, I felt sick after every meal. "Stop being dramatic," Dad said, as I threw up blood into the kitchen sink. But when my blood test results came back, my stepmom's face went pale. The police arrived within minutes to seal the perimeter of our suburban home. I watched from the gurney as Diana gripped her silk robe. Her perfect manicure dug into her palms. Dad stood by the fridge, his newspaper still clutched in one hand. He looked confused rather than concerned. The fluorescent lights of the kitchen felt like interrogation lamps. Diana moved toward me with a glass of water, her smile flickering like a dying bulb. I pushed her hand away, the cold condensation splashing onto my hospital gown. She whispered that I was dehydrated and needed her special electrolytes. Detective Torres stepped between us, her boots heavy on the linoleum floor. She didn't look at my father. She only looked at the half-finished smoothie sitting on the counter. The air tasted like copper. "Robert, tell them she is just exhausted," Diana cooed, her voice trembling. My father finally looked up from his paper, but his eyes were vacant. He told the officers that I had always been a sensitive child with a vivid imagination. I felt the thallium burning in my marrow as he spoke his betrayal. He didn't see the black circles under my eyes or my thinning hair. He only saw the woman who made his life comfortable. He was a spectator to my slow, methodical erasure. Detective Torres held up a clear evidence bag containing a white powder found behind the flour. Diana's composure finally shattered, her breathing coming in jagged, shallow bursts. She claimed it was just an organic supplement for her own chronic fatigue. The detective didn't buy the lie. She signaled for the uniformed officers to move in. I saw the silver handcuffs glinting under the cabinet lights. Diana backed away, her heels clicking frantically against the tile. She looked at the back door, measuring the distance. "Wait," Robert shouted, finally dropping the newspaper as the steel ratcheted shut on his wife's wrists. He tried to block the path, claiming there must be a mistake. The police pushed him aside with a firm, practiced efficiency. They weren't there for his excuses. They were there for the girl who was dying in plain sight. One officer started bagging the tea collection, while another photographed my mother's old ceramic mugs. My father started to cry, but the sound felt hollow and incredibly small. As they rolled me toward the ambulance, I saw the empty space where my mother's portrait used to hang. Diana had replaced it with a mirror months ago. I caught my reflection and barely recognized the skeletal girl staring back, the oxygen mask fogged with my ragged breath. I realized then that my father's silence was the most effective ingredient in her recipe. He watched the doors close without moving a muscle. The sirens began to wail, cutting through the quiet lies of the neighborhood. The ambulance felt like a sterile cage of white light and plastic tubing. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of nausea through my fragile frame. The paramedic checked my vitals while scribbling notes on a digital tablet. He looked at me with a pity that made my skin crawl. I needed to know what they found in my blood before the hospital could flush it away. My hands shook as I reached for my backpack. I pulled out the small flask containing the tea I had saved from breakfast. The liquid was a murky, amber color that smelled faintly of almond and metallic decay. The paramedic noticed the container and reached out his hand. I pulled it back, my knuckles white with the effort. This was my only piece of tangible leverage against Diana. If the blood test failed to show enough, I needed this concentrate. My survival depended on this fall liquid. The emergency room doors hissed open to a chaos of shouting and beeping monitors. Nurses swarmed around me, their movements blurring into a dizzying streak of blue scrubs and latex. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a glass cabinet. My hair was coming out in clumps where the pillow touched my head. A doctor with gray hair appeared above me, his face a mask of professional concern. He asked me when the vomiting started. It started the day she moved in. I whispered, my voice sounding like dry leaves. He nodded solemnly and signaled for more vials of blood. I felt the sharp sting of the needle for the fourth time today. The pressure in my chest was an iron band tightening with every breath. My father was nowhere to be seen in the waiting area. He had stayed behind to protect the woman, who was currently killing his only daughter. A nurse entered with a heavy clipboard and a grim expression on her face. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of peppermint and coffee. She told me that the preliminary screen showed more than just thallium. There were traces of an industrial pesticide that had been banned a decade ago. It explained why my nerves were misfiring like short-circuited wires. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Diana wasn't just guessing. She was using a formula. Suddenly, the police detective returned with a clear evidence bag from our kitchen. Inside was the exact same brand of pesticide the nurse had just described to me. My father followed behind her, looking older and smaller than I remembered. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the evidence and then at my wasted body. The silence in the room was heavy, with the weight of his profound failure. The detective leaned down and showed me a photo of Diana's phone screen. She had been searching for the probate laws regarding my mother's estate all morning. My father's eyes widened as he saw the dates on the search history. They went back years, long before my mother's car went over the cliff. The room spun as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Diana hadn't just replaced my mother. She had cleared the way. The detective's tablet displayed a timeline of digital breadcrumbs that stained my family's history. My father gripped the edge of the hospital bed, his knuckles appearing like white stones. He stared at the screen, watching the log of searches Diana made months before my mother died. The air in the room grew thin and cold as the implications settled. She was at the grief group before I even met her. He whispered. His voice was a broken instrument. I pulled the hospital blanket tighter around my shivering frame, feeling the IV fluids burning. My objective was clear. I had to ensure my father didn't protect her anymore. I watched him struggle to reconcile his image of the loving wife with this predator. She said she loved us, Raven. He pleaded, looking for a shred of normalcy. I didn't answer. I just pointed at the evidence bag containing the stolen thallium. The metal was literally in my blood. The hospital door swung open as a specialist entered with a printed toxicology report. He showed us a graph of the chemical buildup in my system over the last 6 months. The levels spiked every Sunday, right after Diana's traditional family dinners. My father looked at the chart and finally began to weep. It was a pathetic, wet sound that offered no comfort to me. He had ignored every warning I gave him. You need to sign the consent for a stomach pump, the doctor said firmly. I grabbed the pen, but my fingers were too numb to hold it. I dropped the plastic tube, and it rolled under the bed. The pressure to survive was suffocating me as the toxins began to affect my heart rate. A monitor began to beep rhythmically, a sharp, urgent sound that cut through the sobbing. My body was failing while they debated legalities. I'll sign it, my father said, his hand trembling as he reached for the paper. But Detective Torres stepped forward and blocked his path with a steady hand. She explained that his status as a legal guardian was being challenged by the state. Because of his negligence, the hospital was seeking emergency, temporary custody for my protection. He looked at her with a mix of shock and indignation. He was losing his daughter and his power at once. I watched the nurse prepare a thick, black liquid designed to absorb the remaining poison. It was a brutal remedy for a brutal crime. The subtext of the room was clear. Nobody trusted the man who had let this happen. He stood in the corner, a stranger in his own life. The power had shifted from the patriarch to the patient. I swallowed the charcoal, the gritty texture coating my throat like bitter sand. Just as the procedure finished, the detective's radio chirped with a frantic update from the house. The officers reported that Diana hadn't gone quietly to the station. She had managed to stash a second phone in the police cruiser during the chaos. She had sent a single, encrypted message to an unknown recipient using a burner phone hidden in her sleeve before they caught her. The detective's face hardened as she read the transcript of the text. The message said, "The girl knows too much. Finish it." The encrypted text message hung in the air like a death sentence. Detective Torres stepped into the hallway, her hand resting on her service weapon. I looked at my father, searching for a spark of protective rage, but he only stared at his trembling shoes. He was a broken man, hollowed out by a decade of quiet choices. My objective was simple. I had to get out of this vulnerable hospital bed before Diana's hidden partner arrived to finish the job. A shadow moved across the frosted glass of the hospital door. I held my breath, the activated charcoal still coating my tongue with a gritty, earthy weight. A tall man in a generic blue maintenance uniform walked past, pushing a heavy equipment cart. He didn't look in, but the way he paused at the nurse's station felt intentional. My heart hammered against my ribs, an erratic rhythm that made the cardiac monitor chirp. "Stay here, Robert," Detective Torres commanded, pointing a stern finger at my father. She followed the maintenance man, her movements fluid and silent on the linoleum. I reached for my backpack, dragging it toward the bed with weak, shaking fingers. I needed my phone and the sample flask. If I died tonight, I wanted the evidence clutched in my hand. My father didn't move to help me. He just watched the door like a frightened animal in a cage. The cardiac monitor began to wail as my blood pressure plummeted. A nurse rushed in, but she wasn't the one who had treated me earlier. This woman had a jagged scar running along her jawline and eyes that didn't match her forced smile. She held a syringe filled with a clear, colorless liquid. "Time for your sedative, Raven," she whispered. The subtext was terrifyingly clear. This wasn't medicine. It was the final dose Diana had promised in her text. I kicked the rolling tray toward her, sending metal basins crashing to the floor. The nurse lunged, her professional facade vanishing into a mask of cold, surgical aggression. My father finally jumped up, but he tripped over his own feet, falling uselessly against the heart rate monitor. I scrambled toward the headboard, my IV line snapping and spraying blood onto the white sheets. The nurse dropped the syringe, reaching instead for the pillow to smother me. "Help me!" I screamed, but my voice was a raspy, broken shadow of its former self. Just as the pillow descended, the door burst open. It wasn't the police. It was Olivia, my best friend, followed by her mother and a hospital security guard. Olivia didn't hesitate. She tackled the nurse with the fury of a girl protecting her sister. The security guard pinned the woman to the ground, kicking the fallen syringe away. My father just stood there, watching the chaos. The nurse was handcuffed and dragged into the hallway, screaming obscenities about my mother's estate. Detective Torres returned, her face flushed with the adrenaline of a foot chase through the basement. She looked at the syringe on the floor and then at my father. "We found the recipient of the text," she said, her voice like grinding stone. "It wasn't a stranger. It was my father's own brother, my Uncle Mark." The betrayal had a second, deeper layer. The name Mark hit the room like a physical explosion of cold air. My father recoiled as if struck, his face draining of what little color remained. Uncle Mark had always been the financial advisor for the family trust. He was the one who managed the accounts my mother left behind. My objective shifted instantly from survival to securing the digital keys to my inheritance. I grabbed the detective's sleeve, my voice a desperate, thin rasp. I needed the truth. Detective Torres explained that Diana and Mark were high school sweethearts who never truly broke up. Their marriage was a long con designed to drain the estate from the inside. They had been funneling small amounts for years, before my mother's fatal crash. Robert stared at the floor, the realization of his brother's betrayal finally breaking him. He looked like a man who had woken up in a house that was already burned to the ground. The police were moving. The nurse with the jagged scar was actually a former medical assistant Mark had hired. She was being loaded into a squad car while shouting about a second bank account. I watched the hospital monitors flicker as my heart rate finally began to stabilize. The charcoal was working, but the psychological poison was still spreading through my mind. I looked at Olivia, who was holding my hand so tightly her knuckles were white. She was my only anchor. Suddenly, a technician rushed into the room holding a printout of my most recent liver enzyme tests. The damage from the thallium was significant, requiring an immediate and painful procedure to save the organ. The pressure escalated as the medical team began prepping the room for a bedside intervention. My father tried to step forward to hold my hand, but I flinched away. I didn't want his comfort. I wanted his absence. He was just a ghost. "Sign the paperwork for her emancipation," I said, my voice gaining a sharp, icy edge. Olivia's mother, the lawyer, produced the documents from her briefcase like a weapon. If he signed now, he would lose all legal control over my medical care and the trust. Robert looked at the pen as if it were a poisonous snake. He knew that signing meant admitting he was unfit to be a parent. The subtext was clear: sign or face criminal negligence. He signed the papers with a jagged, illegible scrawl that looked like a confession. The weight of the world seemed to lift off my chest, even as the surgeons arrived. I was finally free of his blind eye and Diana's lethal hand. The detective took the signed document and handed it to Olivia's mother for safekeeping. My father turned and walked out the door without looking back. He was a coward until the very bitter end. Just as the anesthesia began to pull me under, the detective's phone rang with a new update. They had located Mark at a private airfield trying to board a charter flight. But he wasn't alone in the hangar. The police found a box of my mother's old jewelry and a stack of forged life insurance policies. The most chilling detail was a single photograph found in his wallet. It was a picture of me taken through my bedroom window last night. The darkness of the anesthesia retreated, replaced by the rhythmic hiss of a ventilator. I woke up in the intensive care unit, my throat raw and my side throbbing from the surgery. Olivia sat in a plastic chair, her eyes red and puffy from a lack of sleep. She held the photograph the police had found in Mark's wallet. The image showed me sitting at my desk, completely unaware of the lens outside. My heart skipped. The predator had been watching me from the shadows for years. The detective entered the room, her boots clicking softly on the polished floor. She carried a thick file filled with the bank records they had seized from the airfield. Mark and Diana had used the trust money to fund a series of failed shell companies in the tropics. They were desperate to hide the theft before I turned 18 and demanded an audit. The pressure was mounting as the legal team prepared for the grand jury. I had to testify while the poison still clouded my brain. My objective was to find the hidden ledger Mark mentioned in his frantic phone calls. Olivia's mother believed it was hidden in the old garden shed behind our house. It was the one place my mother used to spend her afternoons painting before the crash. We had to move fast before Mark's lawyers could secure a warrant to reclaim his personal property. The hospital staff tried to stop me from leaving, but the emancipation papers were already final. I was my own legal guardian now. We reached the house just as the sun began to dip behind the pines. The yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze like a warning flag. My father's car was gone, leaving only deep ruts in the gravel driveway. I walked toward the shed, my legs feeling like leaden weights under my hospital gown. The smell of jasmine and damp earth filled my nose. I remembered my mother laughing in this spot. Now, it felt like a graveyard. The shed door was slightly ajar. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of turpentine and old wood. I searched the floorboards, feeling for any loose planks near the easel. Olivia used her phone flashlight to illuminate the corners of the small room. We found a locked metal box, tucked behind a stack of moth-eaten canvases. My breath hitched as I recognized the initials engraved on the lid. They weren't my mother's. They belonged to Diana. This was her private trophy room. I used a heavy palette knife to pry the lock open with a sharp crack. Inside lay a collection of hair samples, old receipts, and a small vial of clear liquid. There was also a handwritten journal detailing the exact dates Diana had tampered with my mother's car brakes. The level of detail was sickening. She had documented every mechanical failure like a science project. The power balance shifted as I realized I held the evidence of a double homicide. Diana was a serial killer. A floorboard creaked behind us, and the light from Olivia's phone flickered. A man stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the moonlight. It wasn't my father or a police officer. It was Uncle Mark's private security contractor, a man with cold eyes and a silenced pistol. He had bypassed the police perimeter through the woods. He wanted the box back. The silence in the shed was absolute. I gripped the journal against my chest. My life was once again a game of seconds. "Give me the box, Raven," the man said. His voice a low, mechanical drone. I looked at Olivia, signaling her to move toward the back window. The man stepped into the room, the barrel of the gun reflecting the faint light. He didn't care about the money. He was here to clean up the blood. I threw a heavy jar of linseed oil at his head. It shattered against his brow, blinding him with the thick, yellow fluid. We scrambled through the narrow window into the night. We ran toward the tree line, the brambles tearing at my skin and clothes. I could hear him coughing and swearing behind us in the dark. My lungs burned with every ragged breath. We reached the road just as a pair of headlights crested the hill. I waved my arms frantically, praying it wasn't another accomplice. The car skidded to a halt on the gravel. It was Detective Torres. She had tracked my phone's GPS when I left the hospital. She looked at our terrified faces. The detective drew her weapon and ordered us behind the engine block for cover. She radioed for backup while the man from the shed emerged from the shadows. He didn't surrender. He raised his weapon, and the night erupted in a series of muffled pops and flashes. I huddled against the tire, clutching the journal like a shield. When the firing stopped, the man lay still on the grass. The detective checked his pulse and then turned to me. She found a second journal. The second journal was bound in a fraying leather that smelled of my mother's old perfume. Detective Torres flipped through the pages with gloved fingers, her flashlight illuminating sketches of the brake lines and the cliffside. The handwriting was a jagged mimicry of my father's script. This was the final piece of the architectural fraud. Diana had not just planned the murder. She had framed Robert for the initial preparation. My objective was to find the original digital files stored on the shed's hidden server. The server hummed deep within the wall cavity behind the easel. Olivia used her pocket knife to pry back the rotted cedar planks while the detective kept watch on the perimeter. The pressure was intense as the sirens of approaching backup units wailed in the distance. We found a small, black box connected to an old battery pack. This was the hub for the cameras that had recorded every second of my slow poisoning. I grabbed the hard drive, its metal casing feeling strangely warm. We retreated to the police cruiser as forensics teams swarmed the garden. The Scene turn came when the detective accessed the drive on her rugged laptop. The video feed showed Diana standing over my bed 3 nights ago, holding a syringe. But she wasn't alone in the room. My father was standing by the door, watching her work. He wasn't just a victim of manipulation. He was a silent witness to my attempted execution. My blood turned to ice as I watched. He didn't stop her. I whispered, the words catching in my throat. The subtext of his silence throughout the months finally made sense. He was too cowardly to kill me himself, but too greedy to stop her from doing it. Detective Torres squeezed my hand, her jaw set in a hard line. She radioed the units at the station to move Robert from a witness-holding area to a high-security cell. The man who raised me was gone. Only the monster remained in his place. We drove to the precinct through a blur of neon lights and rain, slicked asphalt. My body was crashing from the adrenaline, but my mind was sharper than a scalpel. I had to face him, one last time, to get the location of my mother's original will. The document we had seen was a forgery, but the true one held the key to his complete ruin. The officer at the desk handed me a visitor's badge. It felt like a ticket to a funeral. The interrogation room was a sterile box of gray concrete and mirrored glass. Robert sat at the table, his head in his hands, looking pathetic in the harsh overhead light. I sat across from him, placing the hard drive on the table between us. He didn't look up until I played the video of him watching Diana with the syringe. The silence was a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. He looked at me, and for once, the lie was gone. "Where is the real will, Robert?" I asked, my voice devoid of any warmth. He smiled, a slow and twisted expression that I had never seen before. He told me that my mother had hidden it in the one place Diana would never look. It was inside the lining of my favorite childhood teddy bear, the one Diana had thrown into the attic. He was using the information as a bargaining chip for a lighter sentence. He thought he still had leverage over me. I stood up and leaned across the table, my shadow falling over his face. I told him that I didn't need his bargain, because the police had already found the attic stairs. I saw the flash of genuine terror in his eyes as he realized his last card had been played. He was no longer the father I feared. He was just a small, broken man in a jumpsuit. I turned my back on him and walked toward the exit. The air in the hallway felt cleaner as I moved toward the light of the lobby. Olivia and her mother were waiting for me with a warm blanket and a thermos of tea. I knew this tea was safe because I had watched Olivia brew it myself. We walked out of the station, just as the first light of dawn broke over the city. The nightmare was far from over, but the chains were finally broken. I felt a strange, hollow victory. As we reached the car, my phone buzzed with an alert from the bank. Someone had tried to access the trust fund from an offshore terminal in the last 10 minutes. The detective ran back to her desk, her face tight with a new realization. Uncle Mark had escaped the hangar before the police arrived at the airfield. He was still out there, and he was currently draining the accounts. The micro twist was clear. The architect was still in play. I sprinted toward the detective's desk, my lungs burning with the lingering heat of the thallium. Mark was emptying the accounts from a digital ghost terminal. My objective was to freeze the offshore transfers before my mother's legacy vanished into the ether. The detective tapped frantically at her keyboard, her face bathed in the blue light of the monitor. We had 3 minutes before the final wire cleared. The screen showed a countdown clock that felt like a ticking bomb. The bank's security wall was an impenetrable thicket of encryption and protocols. I grabbed the spare keyboard, my fingers flying across the keys with a frantic, desperate precision. I used my mother's maiden name and her favorite painter as the emergency override sequence. The terminal blinked green, pausing the transaction in its final stage. Mark was logged in from an IP address located inside the precinct's own secure server room. The betrayal was coming from within the very walls meant to protect me. Detective Torres drew her weapon, signaling for a tactical sweep of the basement levels. The power balance shifted as the hunter became the hunted within the building. We moved through the dimly lit corridors, the smell of ozone and old paper thick in the air. I saw a shadow move behind the server racks in the back corner. A cooling fan hummed loudly, masking the sound of our footsteps. We were mere feet away from the architect of my misery. The door slammed shut, locking us inside the high, security server vault. Mark stepped out from behind a terminal, a cold smirk playing on his thin lips. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a master override key. He told us that the money didn't matter anymore, because he had already deleted the digital copies of the real will. He wanted to watch me lose everything my mother had built for me. The subtext was clear. He preferred spite over profit. I pulled the fraying teddy bear from my backpack, showing him the stuffed seams. I hadn't gone to the attic. I had recovered it from the hidden server compartment after my father's confession. I ripped the fabric open to reveal the original paper document, its ink still dark and defiant. Mark's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged across the server rack, but his foot caught on a tangled bundle of fiber optic cables. He fell hard. The police burst through the door, pinning Mark to the floor as he screamed about his birthright. I looked at the physical will in my hands and felt the last of the poison leave my heart. I was finally the master of my own fate. We walked out of the precinct into a world that finally made sense. But as I checked my phone, I saw a final text from an unknown number. It said my mother was still waiting. I looked at Detective Torres, who realized the burner phone was active again, signaling that the conspiracy reached even deeper than the family. The text contained a GPS coordinate for a location I hadn't visited since the accident.